Hey everybody, now we've gone through the arguments that try to reframe how we conceive about the question of whether or not God exists and what is God. It's time to look at arguments that argue that it's just not a really rational premise to believe in God. So we're going to look at an argument presented by a guy called Anthony Flew, which tries to use a thought experiment to think about whether or not it's a rational way to think about the existence of God. Whether or not it's rational to conclude that God exists, right? So we had Pascal's wager, which again was trying to engage in a thought experiment using scenarios or trying to gamble or wager. And now we're going to look at Flew's thought experiment, which tries to answer the question of whether or not it's rational to believe in the existence of a God. So that's what we're going to do. Now, a parable, which I've put here in our overall goal, is a story that has an underlying analogy or an underlying moral behind it. And as we see in the third success criteria, we're going to read a parable, not read a parable, but we're going to explore a parable that tries to answer the question as to whether or not it's a rational idea to believe in the existence of God. All right. So we're going to use a parable to highlight what Flew thought was flawed when trying to prove that God exists. The success criteria, we're going to name, define, and interrelate key terms. We'll define falsification. So we're going to look at another philosopher called Karl Popper, and then look at falsification versus verification. And then we're going to apply the principle of falsification to an analysis of Flew's parable of the invisible gardener. And once we do that, once we achieve the third success criteria, we should be able to see why he thought it was kind of irrational to believe in the existence of a God. So go through 1, 2, 3 success criteria, please. And then what I would like you to do is score each one to say where you're at. Okay, so our APK, and this will become really clear at the end of the class, is to draw a picture of a spaghetti monster. So I'm going to give you 2 minutes to do that for me. Cheers. Now, you might be thinking, why am I drawing a spaghetti monster? Just keep in mind the spaghetti monster, okay, for our discussion at the end of this, of the theory component of this class, okay? Alrighty, here is a man called Karl Popper. Karl Popper is a very well-known philosopher. And one of the things that he's known really well for is his philosophy on science and why he believes that the scientific method and a special part of the scientific method is highly superior when compared to many different forms of thinking. But I might stress too, he knows and he acknowledges there's a lot of bad scientists out there. A lot of bad science, sorry. Alright. Now the first thing we need to know about Karl Popper is he rejects verifications. His argument is that we should not try to prove that things are true. Okay, now you're saying, what? Hey, hang on. He's a philosopher who believes in science. Isn't the whole point of science to try and prove something's true? Well, yes, but the whole point that Karl Popper's coming up with is that when you design a hypothesis that is designed to be proven true, you can kind of prove almost anything. So hypothesis and the scientific investigation shouldn't be about trying to find what is true. It should be about trying to find out what is not true. Because just about anything can be proven true. If you don't believe me, well, let's give you a little scenario here. What if I was to say that lizards were trying to terraform and take over the earth? That all of our politicians were actually lizards, and they're putting in place programs and policies that accelerate the terraforming of the earth to make Earth a habitable environment for their species. So this would then explain global warming. Global warming could be used to support that. An introduction of other pollutants into the atmosphere to make the atmosphere a little bit more breathable for them. The fact that desertification of large areas of the environment is creating an environment that would be similar to an alien-like habitat which they originally came from. And then I started accruing lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of other evidence that just surrounded this hypothesis that aliens are trying to terraform and take over the world. You know what? You could probably come up with, if you were talking to a layman, some argument that could seem quite convincing, could be seen as true. And Karl Popper noticed this when he was young. He started observing a lot of Freudian analysis, and he actually quite liked Freud, and he still does. But he noticed that a lot of people were using just random pieces of evidence to confirm a hypothesis generated from Freud's theory. Okay? But the issue is that, I mean, why don't we just replace the lizard man with the cheese man and then gather a bunch of different facts? In fact, it's so easy to prove any hypothesis and to make it seem true. That's what he was arguing. He noticed that a lot of Freudians were reading the paper and saying, this confirms this particular theory of psychoanalytics. But he's saying, yeah, but it also confirms other theories and many different things. All right, so I need you to quickly take a note. He rejected verificationism because verificationism is an attempt to prove a hypothesis true, and he noticed that just about any hypothesis can somehow be proven true if you assemble the right facts. Okay, so from this, he comes up with a really important realization. The real issue is the way the hypothesis is set up. So if I said, lizards are trying to take over the world, and this is because, and I know this because the Earth is warming up to a temperature that best suits cold-blooded reptiles. That hypothesis can quite easily be proven true. It's a pretty poor hypothesis, but it can be proven true. All right? So what he then said is that the point is to generate hypotheses that have more of a possibility of being proven false. And his classic example is the black swan hypothesis. So if I say all swans are white, we could quite easily imagine a scenario where that hypothesis can be rejected. And that scenario would be, all of a sudden we see a black swan, or a swan that is not white. Okay? And when we develop a hypothesis that we know, that we've deliberately thought about and has the capacity to be proven false, as long as that hypothesis can't be proven false, we know we have knowledge. So let's say we say that all balls, when on the Earth and not confronting any kind of wind resistance or air resistance, follow a parabolic motion. And every time we do it, it follows a parabolic motion. But we know, when they're thrown up and then they fall down, but we know that that could easily be proven false because we could just throw it up and it just goes up and up. Or we could throw it up and it could follow a spiral, right? It could do these other things. But the point is that we know we can easily envisage a way that that hypothesis can be proven false. We know how that can happen. And when we've got a hypothesis like that, if it's never actually proven false, then we've got the closest thing we can have to knowledge, okay? Take a note. Okay, just remember that all your notes should be done in your own words, capturing as much understanding as you can and using as many non-linguistic conventions as you can. Pictures would be so awesome. So for instance, if you drew a black swan hypothesis and also explained the logic of a falsified hypothesis, that'd be brilliant, okay? If you did your lizard example here, a little lizard man, and then drew pictures to kind of show the evidence you could compile to create like a verificationist hypothesis to prove that the lizard man is true, that'd be great. One thing also I hope that you can see is a lot of conspiracy theories rely on verificationist hypothesis. Alright, so the Knights Templar, the Illuminati, the Earth is flat, NASA are trying to suppress religion, all these things, that they frame a hypothesis in such a way where it's easily proven true because you can't really imagine a scenario where it's proven wrong. Alright? There's a lot of really good scientific hypotheses are falsified. They're falsifiable, I should say. In other words, there's a possibility that they can be proven wrong. Now, Anthony Flew took this argument towards religion, all right? And his the main observation is that the fact that God exists, it's a verifications hypothesis. I mean, you could easily put together evidence to support that God exists from an inductive point of view, right? That's because the definition of God is always so flexible. All right? I need you to take a note of that. The fact that the definition of God is so nebulous and vague, it's very hard to pinpoint what God actually is, makes it very easy to generate a verifications hypothesis that always stands up to a test. So could you just take a note of something that I said? And to consider this, Anthony Flew provides us with a parable, all right? Now, a parable is a story designed to make a point. That's what it does. It could be done through analogy, it could be done through allegory, and in this case it's done through allegory, okay? Right, so he invites us to consider two travelers that are walking along and doing some bushwalking, and they come across an immaculately high-ordered garden. And it's important to understand that this highly ordered, highly structured garden is just like it's analogous to the watch that we explored when we were looking at Paley's teleological argument. So it's a system in front of us of extremely high order. All right. And wow, one of them is kind of like convinced that this just happened naturally. There was some kind of natural unknown process that made this happen, but there was no kind of artificial hand or human element that intervened to create the beautiful garden. And the other person says, well, look, this is evidence of design. Can't you see that? It's such an ordered, immaculately cared for garden. It has to be the result of someone's handiwork. So they say, look, let's put this to the test. What we're going to do is we're going to hide out in a hide, and we're going to watch and see if this gardener comes along to tend the garden. And after some period of time, they just don't see the gardener. And so they're convinced that something else must be going on, right? So the one who believes that there's some kind of intervention going on, that this didn't happen naturally, says, oh, well, maybe the gardener's invisible. Maybe we just can't see him, but he's still tending to the garden, maintaining the order, maintaining the ordered garden and its stance. And so they both then say, look, okay, so we need to find another way to detect him. So they lay traps, they put in place lasers and other kind of high-tech scenarios, and they bring out hunting dogs, all designed to perceive or see whether or not the gardener exists in another way. And then after some time, they just don't get anything. So the guy who believes that this is the result of some kind of man-made intervention suggests that, oh, maybe this God works through some other kind of force we're not just aware of, or maybe he can't be smelt, and maybe he has the ability to defy gravity, and maybe because he's invisible, the light just goes straight through, and we didn't need to have these lasers. And then they put together another test, and they say, okay, well, let's put cameras everywhere, and we'll see if we can find another way. Or, we use infrared cameras, infrared cameras to see whether or not God exists, and we can detect him through infrared. And of course, they don't find him. And what happens is that this person who believes that the garden is the result of some kind of man-made intervention keeps redefining the actual definition of what God is, and can do that because, well, not God, what the gardener is, right? And they can do that because they're approaching proving this through a verificationist perspective. They're trying to say, this God exists because basically of the highly ordered environment, and all we need to do is reinvent what the God is to see how we can detect them. Yeah? Right? Whereas the other guy says, look, no, there is no God. There is no gardener. And I've just given it away. The gardener represents God, and of course the garden represents the universe. And this argument doesn't actually say whether or not God does exist. It's just saying, is it rational if you never see evidence of the gardener to believe in the gardener, right? Or is it rational if you never see evidence of the God to believe in the God? And obviously the conclusion is no. No, it's not. And the point is that the definition of God can't be falsified. I mean, how do you actually, if God is this kind of nebulous thing, the thing that transcends our consciousness and understanding, then you can always say, well, okay, I haven't seen a God, therefore God can't exist. And then someone comes on and goes, yes, but God can't be seen. Oh, well, then I haven't heard of God. And I say, yes, but God can't be heard. Oh, okay, then I haven't spoken to God. Yes, but God doesn't talk to us. He communicates to us in other ways. Okay, well, I've never really felt the revelation of God. I've never really felt that, oh, well, that's because God is working in mysterious ways you don't understand. You can see how the definition of what God is just, it's escaping any attempt to falsify it, okay? And like a classic example of a purely hypothesizable, no, a falsified hypothesis would be if I said God was a spaghetti monster, and as a result I say, no. Let me put it this way. Let me actually phrase it in a really falsifiable hypothesis. Okay, let's just say a spaghetti monster has the ability to make things appear out of thin air. And then a spaghetti monster, we saw him, came to the earth and he just couldn't do it. He could never do it. Well, is that a falsifiable hypothesis? We can think about that. If the definition of God became much more concrete, if we said God can be seen and we never saw God, well, again, is that related to the logic of the falsifiable hypothesis? Maybe so, but we can't prove a negative either, can we? So that's the point too. You can't prove that God exists if you've never seen him, because you're trying to prove, how do I put it? No, actually, I've got to be really clear here, because it's so easy to get lost in the way this logic works. If I say God is a being that can be seen, I have a falsifiable hypothesis. Because what I'm doing is saying this is God, and it's easy to imagine a scenario where God can't be seen. So, bang, right in front of you, we never see God, there we go. It's reasonable to just suggest that God can't be seen, even though I've committed a logical fallacy, which is called the affirming the consequent, which is I've never seen God, therefore God never exists, which is illogical. I mean, what's to say God was just never around, all right? But we can get into that as well, okay? We can get into the logic of it. But the point is that in this scenario, we've generated a hypothesis that doesn't actually allow us to test and see if the knowledge is real or not real, okay? And so at this point, if we can ever prove concretely the existence of God, it's just conjecture, it's not knowledge. And this is the thing, a lot of people don't understand this about Karl Popper. He didn't reject the possibility of other things becoming knowledge. He just says they're only knowledge if you can generate a hypothesis that can be falsified but never proven wrong, right? And you can't do that here. You can't falsify. You can't generate a hypothesis that can falsify the existence of the gardener, because the definition of the gardener keeps changing. The same goes with God, all right? So let's go back to the success criteria. We named, defined, and interrelated key terms. We looked at what falsification is, which is basically generating a hypothesis that has the capacity to be falsified. Then we looked at the falsification principle to analyze Flue's parabolic invisible gardener, and we discovered that the gardener definition changes all the time. It's so nebulous that it's impossible to generate a hypothesis about what the gardener is that can actually be proven wrong. Likewise, the same thing goes about God. All right. So therefore, from Flue's point of view, it's irrational to say that God exists. It's irrational to conclude that. It could be conjecture. You could speculate, and one day we might even find out that God exists. But at this point in time, because you have a definition of God that is so beyond concrete and definable, you'll never really be able to fully falsify a hypothesis that can be used to confirm the existence of God. Therefore, it's not knowledge. Okay? That's it.